On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the Chinese president in Europe. No rivalry, rather new progress in relations. And to boldly go where no one has ever gone before, competition or cooperation in space. A Chinese pioneer has the answer.
So it's very natural to collaborate to each other.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping is now on his first overseas trip of the year. His first stop is Rome, then head to Monaco and France from March the 21st to the 26th. Amid rising global economic uncertainty and unilateralism, will cooperation define the relationship between China and the European countries? Take a look.
Italy, the first G7 country to officially participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. The news comes ahead of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Europe. For China, it's a new gateway to European markets, and for Italy, it will be a multi-billion-dollar investment. But within Italy, there are concerns of potential debts and repercussions, while Western allies are worried over the influence and power China might gain in the region. Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte stood firm in playing down concerns.
Obviously, the Chinese economy is a huge economy with huge potential, even for Italian companies, and as a government, we believe that joining the BRI is important, also because, as a geographical location, Italy is the natural terminal of the BRI.
At the same time, the European Union is asking itself how to better work with a stronger China. The European Commission has published a review of the Union's relations with China, labeling the country as an economic competitor and systemic rival. The EU remains China's largest trading partner, and China is the EU's second largest after the US. While China and the US go on with trade negotiations, the EU may be caught in the middle. As China celebrates the 55th anniversary of diplomatic ties with France this year and the 50th anniversary with Italy next year, President Xi's visit is widely expected to inject new dynamism in relations between China and the EU.
For more on Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Europe, we are joined in Rome by Ferdinando Nelli Ferracci. I hope I pronounced your name right, sir. The president of the International Affairs Institute in Italy. Also joining us in Paris, we have Alexei Polan, who is the co-founder of Monde Moderne. In our Beijing studio, we have Mr. Cui Hongjian, the director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. I should really say, gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Going to go to you first, Mr. Ferracci. About Italy, this time certainly a big stop for Chinese President Xi Jinping. Will Italy lead the way, some say, for European countries to interact with China?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that, of course, Italy is willing to play an important role in developing and intensifying relations with China. Italy will not be the first European country to sign a memorandum of understanding on the BRI. Already 13 members of the European Union have signed a similar memorandum of understanding. So we're not the first. Most likely we will not be the last. And this is a sign of an interest by the Italian authorities, by the Italian government, by Italy in general, towards this important phenomenon which is China these days. Most likely the first economic global power in a short period of time, and one of the protagonists in the world scene.
I see. I really have to say, Mr. Ferracci, I really like the backdrop that you have over there in your studio, certainly showing the beautiful culture of Italy. No wonder many are fascinated about your country. Mr. Polan, let me go to you also. France, another country with a lot of history and a lot to be proud of in Europe. What about France's attitude? There seems to be some difference between what's going on in Rome and in Paris, Mr. Polan.
Yeah, it's a different take with France.
Very diplomatic,
and
you are
Italy,
saying.
because
A different take.
Yes, definitely, because there has been some rift between both President Emmanuel Macron and Salvini about the upcoming European elections. So Emmanuel Macron is trying to position himself as the most European, pro-European leader in Europe compared to Matteo Salvini, who has been branding as a populist and a nationalist leader. So of course it's a different approach. And you've seen also this different approach to China or Russia or big neighbors, where Europe is trying to find a middle ground and to be more protectionist as it was before. All this due to the turn that it took, of course, in the US with Donald Trump and being openly protectionist. So now it's the turn to Europe to be more cautious and look at China as a potential partner, but also a very big competitor.
Wait a minute, Mr. Poulan. I have to remind you, is there something called Europe, or is there something called European countries and the European Union? Those are very different concepts. So, Mr. Poulan, are you telling me Europe is likely to have a very coordinated approach to China? I have to point that out. Maybe you need some coffee. Go ahead, Mr. Poulan. Mr. Poulan, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, and they have you on screen.
The question is whether Europe is going to have a coordinated approach.
Show them.
Well, there seems to be some problems over there with the earpiece. So let me go to you, Mr. Cui, in Beijing. You were tentatively listening to your two colleagues, one joining from Paris, the other from Rome. Your takeaway from their comments earlier?
I can get a very deep impression about these comments from our Italian and French guests. I think our Italian guests should a little bit cautious about the issue of the MOU of BRI between China and Italy, because he stressed that Italy is not the first European country to sign this kind of document with China. But I would like to say Italy should be the first. Why not? Because anyway, so far, not any other strategic purpose from China through the BRI, and once Italy try to sign this MOU with China, I think that all of them are the opportunity and the chance for the Italian development. Regarding to the French guests' comments, I think that yes, I can understand the very, very difficult choice for European Union and between perhaps United States and China. But I don't think it's an issue about the BRI.
I see.
Because BRI could not be the instrument of China to deal with any challenge or competition with the United States.
Let's put the BRI issue a bit later. Let me ask you about this first, Mr. Cui, if I can. That is, we talk about different approaches inside Europe among different capitals and also in Brussels. Obviously, Chinese President Xi Jinping is visiting some of the European capitals. There's another meeting taking place in Brussels talking about the European Commission's approach toward China, whether they will be coordinated. What do you make of this, the nature of this discussion? Where do you think it is heading for?
Firstly, I think it gives us a very good picture of how is China-EU relations. On one hand, it becomes more and more important because in the past, it's difficult for you to find out any opportunity for European Union for the summit to discuss the China issue. But now, frequently, they talk about China, its a threat or its opportunity always. But of course, at the same time, I think this document and also this summit for European Union is trying to find out the connective attitude or single policy towards China.
Okay.
But
well, you're talking about connective attitude. We got the other two guests once again connected to us, I hope, by listening to us clearly, I hope. in that way. But let me go to you, Mr. Poulain from France. What about that meeting going on in Brussels? Will that in any way shape the future discussions during Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to some of the European capitals, or they are likely to go very different tracks?
Well, yeah, it's all the weakness of the European Union so far, is that there's been a lot of talking, and it's very difficult for all the partners, 27, to reach an agreement. So it takes time for anything to deal with the business, tax, or employment. And clearly, it's easier for any country to deal directly with a country than with Brussels. And that's why Europe is a dwarf on the international stage. It has no army, and it has no diplomacy. So far, it's a construction between neighbors for a big market, but there is no political projection of Europe so far.
Our French guest is very direct, I have to say, very different from the real, like a French personality, saying there's no coordinated policy at all when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to EU, to China included. Is it true?
To a large degree, it's true. Because as we know, among all of the member states of the European Union, they do have a different understanding about the Chinese role in their own development, and they do have a different, understanding of her relations with China, different history, different concepts. But indeed, as an institution, European Union always trying to take efforts to find a so-called single voice. But indeed, I would like to say, behind this so-called single voice of European Union, many is an effort from some major member states. They want to push forward this kind of single voice. But indeed, I don't think that it will change the reality that the imbalance of the European countries' policy towards China. For example, regarding to the issue of the single policy for European Union towards China, some countries, some European countries, they will argue that, how about France and Germany? France and Germany, they got a lot of benefits in the cooperation with China.
Well, we have a French guest with us, so we better ask him about that. What about that approach? Whether France is likely to be very independent in terms of designing its strategy toward China, no matter what are some of the voices there in Brussels trying to advocate? Mr. Poulain.
Yeah. Yes, of course. This Franco-German axis is not, of course, it's something on paper.
Please go ahead and talking. No, we have problems? Well, let's come back to our Chinese guest. It's great that we have a Chinese guest sitting in the studio to continue the conversation. We hope it will be connected later to our two other European guests. Talking about connectivity, by the way.
Yes.
So, Mr. Cui, earlier you were talking about whether different countries will come up with their own approach, depending on what their biggest national interests are toward China. How do you see France vis-à-vis Italy in that regard?
To some degree, I think Italy and France, they share the similar attitude towards China. For example, they also stressed that any kind of cooperation with China, especially in BRI, it could be follow the regulation from European Union. I think it's true, because they are member states of the European Union. They do have the obligation to this organization. But at the same time, I think that they do have a different approach regarding to China. Why? Because they do have a different requirements.
Like what kinds of different approaches?
For example, now for Italian government, now the big issue or the big priority is to develop economy and also to deal with some very, very big problem. But so far, they didn't get any substantial assistance from the European Union and the Eurozone. So I think it gives a very, very big chance for Italian government to look for some support, cooperation from outside, especially from China. Because so far, if you take account of the major economies in the world, United States, Japan, China, and some European economies, China is owning the single economy to keep its opening up and free trade, everything. And now China has, I think, a capability enough to do something more.
What about for France?
France, I think now the question is, how about President Macron? Macron has a very big ambition to do something more. He stressed this, how to say, the issue of European renaissance. What does it mean for renaissance? I think for France, for Mr. Macron, maybe to have a protected Europe. If we look at the recently, changes or policy process, now France and Germany, they try to firstly learn something from China. For example, they try to have some new industry policy.
Right.
They want to have an integrated, industry within European Union to have a more competitiveness with China, like that. So I think now the difference between Italy and France, to a large degree, is from perhaps the leader's personality and also ambition for leaders, and also, indeed, the real understanding what's the real interests of France and Italy.
Now, I hope Mr. Poulan can hear us well. I hope, huh? Thank you for your patience, sir.
Yes, I do, sorry.
See, there is a lot of things that the two sides can work on. Connectivity is certainly one of those. And confidence building. Thank you for your confidence in continuing this conversation with us, Mr. Poulan. Let me ask you about that. France has big ambition. That's no secret throughout history. Now, when the U.S. is having a very different approach, apparently, toward China, at least for the moment, how will France make its choice? Just a reference before you speak. Earlier, I talked to the former Chinese ambassador to France, who quoted Charles de Gaulle when he was establishing diplomatic relations with China 55 years ago. He was talking about the necessity, and it's also a reasoning deed to do. So what do you make of current psychology of France now, dealing with China?
I think, as you said, since de Gaulle, France has been very keen to develop a strong relationship with China, and it was the same under President Chirac about 10 years ago. A lot has changed since then, and within the European construction and within the alignment of France towards the more Atlantic relationship with the US, as was the Second War in Iraq and other positions that our country has taken so far. So I think it's unclear what Emmanuel Macron and what France will do. But one thing is sure is that business community and a lot of political leaders think that a strong link with China is very important for diplomatic reasons, business reasons, and everything. But right now there is a strong push towards a more NATO approach or Atlantist approach in Europe, saying that we should be more prone towards aligning ourselves to the US interest rather than to our own interest, which is the problem right now. So it's different, but we'll see. Clearly there is a dinner on Sunday night in Nice with President Macron and President Xi, and they will discuss, and that shows that there is still this will of having a special relationship between France and China.
Right. Mr. Faraci, I was pleasantly informed that you are also connected to us now as well. Mr. Faraci, the question of independence is very important for the European foreign policy. What about that issue, the issue of independence? Will that spirit be held on to in terms of the Europeans' approach, at least Italy's approach to China?
Sorry, I had problems in remaining in connection with you. I didn't hear what the Chinese expert said, and I did not understand correctly your question. Could you repeat it again, please?
Yes. My question rather is, the Europeans have been advocating the spirit of independence in foreign policy, despite of the Atlantic alliance. Now, is it a time to test?
No, it's not. I don't agree with your assumption that Europe is asking for independence was assuming that independence is a must. Europe has, of course, its own autonomy in developing its own foreign policy, taking into consideration the different sensitivities of the various member states, as we have seen in particular when it comes to relations with China. But we also have our fundamentals. One of the fundamentals is the transatlantic relationship. So we have to develop an autonomous international projection and foreign policy while respecting traditional alliances. But this does not imply that Europe as such, and the European Union in particular, and the member states of Europe, could and should develop intensified relations with China. By the way, today and tomorrow, our leaders in Brussels will discuss exactly, among other things, this subject as part of the preparation for the incoming EU-China summit, which will take place on April 9th in Brussels. So I think that yes, of course, we would like to maintain and develop an autonomous international projection, but respecting our traditional alliances.
Right. Before we go, I want to have final words from both you, Mr. Faraci, and our Chinese guest. Very briefly, what do you make of the sequence that we are seeing right now? Brussels discussion about coordinated or not China approach, Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to different capitals inside Europe, then later on followed by the European-China summit. So how will this sequence help us to find the right direction? Mr. Faraci, you want to go first? Briefly.
Yes. Well, at least as far as the position of Italy is concerned, I don't see a contradiction between what will be agreed upon during President Xi Jinping's visit in Rome and the idea that the European Union as such could and should have a common positions towards China.
Yeah.
I have compared carefully the two papers, the Memorandum of Understanding, which will be signed by China and Italy on this occasion, and the document which is being discussed today and tomorrow in Brussels, and I haven't seen fundamental contradictions. There is probably a little more of caution in the European approach than in the Italian one, but there is no fundamental contradiction. I would say there is also coherence and compatibility.
And we have 40 seconds left for you, Mr. Cui.
I think that even I understand it's difficult for European Union to make some choice, but I don't think that it's a good reason for European side to keep this traditional alliance with the U.S. and then to refuse any kind of cooperation from China. China would be a new alliance in economy, in prosperity, everything with the European Union.
And the European capitals as well.
Yes.
We don't want to forget that layer as well. So for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us. This is a big moment for China and the European countries. We hope both sides will go through that period with pride and also with prosperity. Thank you for Ferdinando Nelly Faraci, Alexis Boulan, and also Cui Hongjian. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us.